Welcome to Fair Observer Exclusive. I am Glenn Carl.
I'm Hardeep Singh, and at FA Exclusive today we have two, not our usual three, issues for the month. So FA Exclusive today is going to focus on 1. Indo-Canadian tensions signal new Indian assertiveness on global stage. 2. How are Ukrainian and Russian war economies doing now? So, number 1. Indo-Canadian tensions signal new Indian assertiveness on global stage. Now, a chap was killed. On 18 June 2023, as per my notes. His name was Hardeep Singh Nijjar, and he was killed by 2 masked gunmen outside a gurdwara, which is a Sikh temple, and he was a Canadian citizen, and this has led to a huge row between India and Canada. Justin Trudeau calls it a political assassination of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. The Indians, of course, deny it. Now, Glenn, you've been an old hand at this sort of cloak and dagger stuff. So, could this be a false flag operation? Indians are not known for these kinds of actions. Might the Chinese or Pakistanis be involved, or might this even be pure gang war?
Well, that a gang member or members be involved is quite possible, but as pawns or peons, tools for the Indians, the Canadians are very careful in what they say internationally in their international positions. It is really just about inconceivable that Trudeau would go public with a denunciation or a description of an assassination unless he were convinced, unless the Canadian government were convinced that this, in fact, be the case. So I have worked with the Canadians, diplomats, and my counterparts in intelligence, and I really do know them to be prudent. In fact, you don't need my experiences to see this. The Canadians, I think, without exception, historically, have not really engaged in the Machiavellian posturing and misleading statements from time to time to advance national interests that quote great powers unquote do. I'm not asserting that the Canadians are Pollyannas or little Lord Fauntleroys or Goody Two-Shoes. They serve their national interests also, but they define them as most middling power democracies do, by affirming, at least Western nations, by trying to affirm the normative system, international law. So it really is inconceivable to me that the Canadians would simply be putting something out to advance national purposes that they knew not to be true or was a distortion of reality. I think we do know the story
but hang on a minute.
Pretty well.
Hang on a minute. He's talked about credible allegations, so there isn't yet proof, and there isn't yet conviction in court. So it's a little.
Well, that's a very good point. It's a very good point, but
yeah.
But it's a good point for a reason I think most people won't bring to mind immediately. A frustration. One of the main frustrations that policymakers have, and then one step removed, the public often can have with intelligence agencies and intelligence work, is that you will almost never hear any intelligence agency say or conclude that something is certain. It will always say, it being the intelligence agency, that the preponderance of evidence indicates that, or we believe it most likely that. You won't say ever we know for a fact that the Indians did this. Even if, let's assume, and I'm totally making this up, let's assume that there are recordings of Prime Minister Modi to the head of the service saying, do the following, kill this guy on a certain day.
He wasn't important enough. They had the G20 to worry about. I really don't think he was important enough for Narendra Modi to even give a rat's ass about him.
Oh, I won't go down that direction quite yet. That gets into the authorities delegated to an intelligence service. And usually for assassinations, the political leaders keep that pretty closely under their control.
I see.
But in any event, even were there a recording saying this, the Canadian service or the Americans or any intelligence service would still say, we have a recording that it seems to indicate that, rather than saying, here is the absolute proof. And even when you have the proof in intelligence, with intelligence information, often that evidence is insufficient to convict somebody in a court of law for a host of reasons. So that doesn't surprise that the Canadians say there are indications that, or whatever the exact terminology was, is sort of intelligence speak and prudence. But I really don't think that the Canadians would say this without a doubt. But to me, with any doubt, rather, to me, the assassination of this individual, significant as it is for Indian-Canadian relations and for this man's family and for what it says about Sikhs and Canadian domestic politics and so on, all of that nonetheless is secondary to the larger issue for me about what this indicates. And this is something I think that we have spoken about, I have written about, which is the surprisingly rapid emergence of India as not just a great power, but as a superpower. It is acting as one now pretty clearly, even though you can look at GDP of India compared to that of China or the U.S. and say, oh, it's still dwarfed. That's a relevant factor, but it's only one of them. When you look at the size of the population, the size of the military, the trends of the economy, the stakes at play, the role that India is not just willing to play, but is now assuming in a host of international issues, both in a multilateral sense and, of course, advancing India's own national interests as it defines them, or at least as the BJP the ruling party defines them. This is a dramatic change. So I would liken the assassination in Vancouver of a Sikh Canadian citizen to what we have talked about, you and I, in previous sessions, happening in the Solomon Islands. And these are two seemingly bizarre, inconsequential areas. It's not the Fulda Gap of Germany with the Soviets, lined up against the NATO, and it's not a nuclear weapon test someplace. But each of them signals this dramatically different world that's emerging since really 2012, I would say. And we've talked about how Beijing has been the center of these changes, really. But India is only a decade behind in many ways, and is now asserting its role. I see you want to jump in for a second, so I'll stop.
Yeah. So my question is, you have no doubts that India conducted this operation? That's what you think?
No, I have none whatsoever. No, okay. No, I don't. I of course do not know what assassination operations the Indian intelligence service called the RAW has conducted. But my understanding is that assassination is not unknown to the RAW. But two important points: they have never. All of the assassinations, or any assassination that may have been done by them, has occurred in states peripheral to, adjacent to India, and never in a Western middle power or great power democracy. There are formal laws about killing someone, of course, but there are informal rules of the road that intelligence services pretty consistently adhere to, which is that if a country, a service commits and assassinates someone, it generally won't be in. Well, great powers don't do it in each other's countries. That practice was pretty well true until the last decade, when Russia initiated a large number of assassinations, primarily in Great Britain.
But is Great Britain a great power?
Because yes, well,
because maybe the reason they are conducting assassinations in Great Britain is it's not that great anymore, and they conducted a huge number. I believe you said the number was 55, if I'm not mistaken.
It was the number that came to mind was 47, but 47, it continues to go up in the last 12 years or some such thing as this. Yeah, it's not a great power, but it's still a significant power. Yeah, we have to define great power. Yeah. In any event, the reason for the Russian freedom of action, feeling impervious to any particular counter move, seems to be, and this is shockingly bad for the government of Great Britain, that there are hundreds of billions of pounds worth, of dollars worth of Russian oligarch money sitting in the city of London and elsewhere, and that the British haven't wanted to upset this beneficial apple cart, as it were, which is pretty shocking.
Yeah. And so to get back to the India-Canada thing, with due respect to RAW, it ain't the Mossad, although Indian social media has gone hysterical. In fact, Indian social media and Indian news were claiming credit for these assassinations for a while. So the jingoistic strain that you see in India is quite comical. But it lacks maturity. But more importantly, unlike the Mossad or unlike the CIA, no one really wants to join RAW when they end up getting assigned to it. What do I mean by that? It's a very simple fact. It's a well-known fact in India that the civil services examination, the annual examination that everyone writes, there's only one prize, the Indian Administrative Service, the IAS, and they control everything. They control the Archaeological Survey of India, they control the Commerce Ministry, they control the Finance Ministry, they even control Home Ministry, which is the Internal Security Ministry, and they control the Defense Ministry, which is the defense of the realm. So the reality is that there is power and there is payoff. You could very easily earn $100 to $200 million, and I mean US dollars, not Australian or Canadian dollars. If you were in the IAS, corruption is a way of life. You're accountable to no one. And so what happens is that this most powerful and unaccountable service in the world gives you a lifetime of social deference for one exam you clear in the 20s. So who ends up in the RAW, which is people who didn't get the IAS, ended up in another service, often who ended up in the Indian Police Service. And often in the Indian Police Service, those who are unhappy with either the state they were assigned or the chief minister of their state, and they want out and they want to come to Delhi and they want their kids to study in posh schools like Sanskriti or St. Columbus or whatever the posh schools are, I don't know, or British International School. And the reality is that the RAW simply lacks the expertise, the knowledge, the networks that the Mossad does. But perhaps they have the same aspirations, which is why you could argue that the job was such a botched job. Well, if it was their job.
You don't have to be an Einstein to be an intelligence officer or to be an assassin. And there's a famous book which most of our viewers, listeners will at least know the title of, although it's getting to be an old one now, called The Best and the Brightest, about how the elite of the United States and the foreign policy, intelligence, and policymaking establishments led us into the disaster of Vietnam specifically. and they may not be the top exam getters, and they may be frustrated professionally, but they can still follow orders, and it doesn't take brilliance to be to act thuggishly. I want to do two things, though, which I think are significant, and why I think this issue is significant. First, I'll talk a little bit more narrowly about the Indian-Canadian issue with regard to the assassination, and then the one that I touched upon, at least alluded to, which is the larger, why is this, I think, more significant than an assassination of a Canadian? So, surprisingly, Canada has more Sikhs than India as far as the percentage of the overall population. 1.7% of India is Sikh, 2.1% of Canada is Sikh.
That's correct. But the number is, absolute number is, of course, much higher in India because it's a 1.4 billion denominator.
Right.
Yeah.
However, the significance politically of the Sikh population in Canada is real. And Justin Trudeau's coalition does have the Sikh party that is part of it. I truly do not believe for a moment that Trudeau would have gone public on an issue concerning assassination perpetrated by a major power that that Canada is having awkward relations with, unless he believed it were the case. But it nonetheless is a factor. Now, the reason the Sikhs in Canada are worthy of attention, I think, rather than the fact that they are involved in Trudeau's party coalition, is the fact that India has legitimate grievances about the actions of Sikhs in Canada over the past 40 years. Now, we know that Indira Gandhi was assassinated by her bodyguards who were Sikh. They assassinated her because she had sent the Indian army into the Golden Temple, a Sikh temple in India, to detain or kill Sikh militants who have been seeking independence from India, a separate state in India, which reasonably the Indian government can interpret as a threat to the integrity of the nation, since that's literally what the Sikhs are arguing. However, the Indian army was probably incredibly crude, if it was done by design, then just hideous were the political orders, because hundreds of Sikhs, independent of the people they were seeking, were killed in the operation. 8 months later, that was in 1983.
And not just that operation, the operations continued through the 80s, but I'll clarify later once you finish.
8 months later, a plane blew up not far from Ireland. It had taken off from Canada. Several hours after that, so we're talking 1984 right now, hours after
85 was the plane. 84 was Operation Blue Star, the Golden Temple, the holiest temple. 85 is the plane, Air India plane, Kanishk.
Then a few hours later in Narita Airport of Tokyo, some luggage blew up, also killing some people. And the luggage was traced to an Air Canada flight, which had taken off from inside of Canada. The perpetrators, authorities, Canadian, Indian, international, investigated this and traced this back to Sikh militants in Canada, whom, of course, these were acts of terrorism. There's simply no defining it any other way, viewing it any other way. The Indians asked to have extradited for trial. They were not extradited. They were punished, but in India's view, dramatically inadequately was the level of their punishment. This kind of behavior, not terrorist actions, but militancy in favor of an independent Sikh state within what is currently India, has continued. And the Canadians saying freedom of speech is a fundamental right to a free society, which is, of course, true. The Indians responding, well, that's all well and good, but if it advocates the destruction of a state, then perhaps that's not acceptable, which is also a reasonable argument to make. And then this fellow who was assassinated has been indicted, at least by the Indians, but I think there's a warrant for him by Interpol since 2016, allegedly for having committed, allegedly, however one terms this, a terrorist bombing. I guess bombing would be terrorist by definition, in India. So the Indians have cause to be focused on this man and this issue, which doesn't justify an assassination. And the Canadians have reason to try to defend its citizens, its sovereignty, and the freedom of speech. So that's what's happened brought us to this bad circumstance between India and Canada. Their relations are the worst they've ever been. They've expelled diplomats mutually and so on. That's all the standard dance of an issue of this sort. But to me, the larger issue, as I say, is what this says about India's growing role. This happened, almost exactly at the same time as the G20 summit, which India presided over. Now, the G20, it's sort of a feel-good, we look good, insubstantial body. However, it does posture and perception are also reality, and India has continued to present itself or pursue a policy that does not that explicitly avoids aligning itself either with the two blocs that there are now and always been, the West, still led by the United States, or China. But it's not just a non-aligned. India is not simply pursuing a non-aligned position, which India has done since 1947, really. Yeah. It is a way to leverage the global South states to India's benefit, rather than standing off from the great power clashes. Rather, it's a way of asserting Indian positions. This is happening at the same time that India now is starting to assassinate people it doesn't like, places that it never had done before, because they can get away with it in pursuit of its national interests rather than what the West, the United States, like to affirm are international norms. And it's doing this at a time when it is also aligning itself, becoming a closer partner with the United States and other Western states to oppose China in a host of ways, many of them maritime, but also economic. And at a time that it is now actively engaging in international diplomacy to seek its own ends. The example I've given before is that of Armenia, where India is now selling hundreds of millions of dollars of weapons to Armenia, injecting itself in a totally unsolvable problem, but nonetheless playing an international role. So this assassination, the G20 role, the closer alliance activity with the West, more direct opposition to China, arms sales, international role, that a role of a superpower in disputes that don't have anything directly to do with India, all show India has become now one of the three great powers on Earth. That's why, to me, this assassination is significant.
All right, so Glenn, let me walk through the grievances India has had over the years. I mean, a key thing to notice is that Justin Trudeau waded in very publicly when the farmers were agitating in India. When India brought in farming legislation to reform the farming sector, Justin Trudeau, because he wanted the support of his Sikh voters, waded in without knowing the facts on the ground. In fact, we wrote a big piece, if you may remember, explaining the legislation and how it was breaking the socialist model that India adopted, inspired by the Soviet Union. So that upset the Indian policymakers, particularly the politicians. The bureaucrats, they follow orders, but it upset the politicians in India's middle class and some sections of the bureaucracy, diplomacy, and intelligence too. Then he allowed a referenda on independent Khalistan. Now, Khalistan is the independent state Sikhs have been demanding. Once in the 1980s, it was a movement. It was handled crudely. In fact, Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale, the person who became the martyr for these militants and terrorists, and let's not hide the fact that they were terrorists. They were supported by inter-services intelligence. They would plant bombs in crowded marketplaces. I grew up in the shadow of that terrorism. My father operated on soldiers blown to bits by those terrorists. Yes, some of them genuinely believed that they were fighting for freedom, but a lot of them were just fanatical. They were as fanatical as the Taliban. So let's not forget that. And that period, because Indira Gandhi promoted Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale, who took refuge in the Golden Temple for a few votes. She was basically playing vote bank politics. And then it boomeranged. She was assassinated herself. She had to send in the army. It was a crude operation. By the way, it was led by a Sikh, General Brar. It wasn't led by a Hindu. And eventually the insurgency was crushed by KPS Gill, another Sikh, and not just a Sikh, but a Judge Sikh. So it was the Sikhs who ended the Sikh insurgency because they thought, hang on a minute, we are doing rather well in India. In fact, Manmohan Singh went on to be Prime Minister. India's economy was liberalized by Manmohan Singh and Montek Singh Ahluwalia, two Sikhs. In fact, Manmohan Singh refused a visa to this person. So long before the BJP, there has been, before the ruling party, Bharatiya Janata Party, has come to power, there has been this extraordinary national grievance against Canadian actions. And for Trudeau to allow a referenda on independent Khalistan in Canada is like India having a referendum on Quebec in India. Imagine if Quebecois had immigrated to India. Of course they haven't. We are a poorer country. But if they were and we allowed that referendum, I don't think Canada would look upon it too nicely and too politely. As of now, I disagree with you. I think Justin Trudeau is being criticized left, right, and center. He's in political hot water. He is supported by Jagmeet Singh of the New Democratic Party. The New Democratic Party has 25 seats out of 338 in Canada's parliament. And Jagmeet is attacking Trudeau. He said only yesterday, or 7 hours ago, I believe, so not even yesterday, today, he said Trudeau is not interested in bringing change. And the point is that Trudeau has been silent on Sikh extremists, people who've been advocating terror as an instrument of achieving independence. If it's a peaceful independence movement, that's one thing. But supporting or turning a blind eye to people who are advocating the use of wanton violence against civilians is something else. Temples have been attacked in Canada by Sikh extremists. Of course, there's been little action on that. And the Khalistan movement of the 1980s has degenerated into the Khalistan cults. There are various groups in Canada in particular. Each of them wants to fly the flag of independence. Each of them basically is at loggerheads because they all want the sympathy, they all want the support, they all want the money. And they, of course, pocket some of the money and use some of it to foment trouble in India. So if we look at Hardeep Singh Nijjar, who was killed on 18 June, there was a red corner notice against him by the Interpol. Yet Canada took him in, yet Canada gave him citizenship. And this has been upsetting Indians for a while. There's also history. Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father, refused to extradite Talvinder Singh Parmar after the downing of the Air India 182 Montreal to London flight in 1985. It wasn't just the baggage that blew up in Tokyo. The whole plane blew up over the Atlantic.
329 people killed.
Yes, over the Atlantic. And there was no action. And Canada said, no, we are not extraditing him. So there's history here, particularly with the Trudeaus. And from an Indian point of view, Trudeau has a white savior complex. He has this classic paternalistic, let me reform you, mission civilisatrice, as Peter Isaacson would recognize this civilizing mission syndrome. And he has touched off a lot of raw nerves in India. That is why I suppose the Indian reaction And this is not just a party-based reaction. In fact, the best defense of India has come from Shashi Tharoor, who is a member of the Congress party, whom many want to be the leader of the Congress party instead of the dynastic Rahul Gandhi. He has come out guns blazing and said Canada is unnecessarily spoiling relations. We can talk as big boys, but this public melee, this degeneration of relations is not in any country's interest. So that's the backstory, getting into the detail of Canada-India relations. From India's point of view, Canada has deliberately and systematically over the decades turned a blind eye and is promoting the disintegration of the nation itself and promoting terrorism on Indian soil. That is fundamentally through an Indian lens. That is the point of view. Now, in the past, India would have ignored it, and India did ignore it. India ignored, for instance, in 1985, the Air India 182 plane blowing up in the mid-Atlantic. But now India feels confident enough to say, you know what, if you're going to raise this matter internationally, well, we also have levers. So many Indian students study in Canada. Maybe they'll stop studying in Canada. Maybe we won't have Canadian investment as much coming to India. And maybe we will just stop giving visas to Canadian citizens. So this is turning into a real escalation, and it would be interesting to see how things transpire, because Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, has waded into it. The Australian Foreign Minister has waded into it, and Kanwal Sibal, our friend, the former Foreign Secretary of India, has been writing against the Anglosphere's still imperial tendencies.
I'll just make two last points here. One, you touched upon the, if not universal, widely shared reaction in India. And to me, that says at least as much about the nature of the Indian government, current government, and implies actually alarming things, which the Indians don't, which the BJP, the ruling party, doesn't like to hear, but how it is conflating nationalism with the party and with sort of a jingoistic patriotism becoming de rigueur, and dissent being unacceptable. As well as still vestigial prickliness. But I never have encountered any Indian official who lacks in self-confidence. I think it's a function of power rather than confidence. I heard many times, almost reflexively, how the largest democracy in the world was India, how the oldest civilization in the world was Indian, and how, of course, the benighted mongrel nations of the West really should understand their place in the larger scheme of the universe.
That's a front. That's a front. Scratch deeper, and there is enormous insecurity even today.
Well, but the two things can coexist simultaneously.
Yeah.
The last point I haven't touched at all upon whether this covert action, an assassination is a covert action, is a wise act itself, this one, and whether assassination is wise to engage in as policy.
Even the Mossad boshed things up in the UAE.
Yeah, and the temptation for policymakers is always to use covert actions when there's an intractable problem, because it seems to offer a free, no-cost solution. Well, no one will ever know. Our problem will be eliminated, and we can all go happily on to the future. And that is almost never the case. Even, as Atul said, a really superb intelligence organization, with regard to assassinations at least.
They are superb. I mean, Glenn, to be fair, the Mossad is superb at what they do. We may not like what they do, but they are brilliant at what they do.
Another subject. But even they are caught. And the United States, to its chagrin, but not to its increased wisdom, learns almost every time that it engages in covert action that over time, medium term and long term, at least, the costs outweigh the benefits of the act. So India may certainly weighed before conducting the act that it would be better to no longer have this man alive than to have him alive. But they may well find that the cost in relations not just with Canada, but to India's reputation, the trust that it would have in other nations, the wariness that this might engender, the hostility, which already has been, or resentments of the Sikh population may be increased to, which could lead to yet greater troubles. All of these things could happen and generally do after covert actions. Yeah. And the intelligence services of the United States, and I think of England too, have long tried to convey to policymakers the dangers of engaging in covert actions, and repeatedly, of course, are overruled and told to do what they're told to do.
You mentioned
so
how
India may well find this to be the case too, now that it is using its elbows in a more aggressive superpower way.
Yes, you mentioned once that 1953, in your view, was a covert action that succeeded spectacularly in the short term, but backfired ridiculously in the long term. And the 1979 Islamic Revolution, we can send a thank you card for those who carried out the 1953 coup. And there are many such instances we've talked about. I mean, to your point about the Sikhs, I'd be very careful of lumping all Sikhs into one category. Ajay Banga is the president of the World Bank. Sikhs are in top positions in the Indian army, in the Indian business community, in policy making. The Sikhs control businesses worldwide. They're a pragmatic community. They even control the Parmesan and mozzarella business in Italy. So most Sikhs want to just get on with business. They are a model minority. Now, there's a large fringe of extreme Sikhs in Canada because of Canada's immigration policy. They attracted the most extreme Sikhs. And there are some fringe elements in the US and Australia and the UK and Germany. But other than that, if you look at Sikhs in India, they have moved on. They have bought into the idea of India as a nation by a large majority. They have had a prime minister. Just imagine a prime minister for 10 years from their community. So they know that if they got an independent landlocked Khalistan between India and Pakistan, that would be a disaster. So the Sikh community is not really anti-India. There are, of course, Khalistani cults, and this action perhaps has given them yet another martyr on the wall. Just as Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale is a martyr, and he was practically illiterate, and he was a thug. Another thug, maybe India has made a martyr out of that person, and I'll give you that. I'll of course concede that point. It is much better to arrest people, try them, and convict them in a court of law. And the repercussions of Guantanamo and extraordinary rendition and drone strikes hurt America's global image. So perhaps such actions, covert actions, are best used sparingly. And I take your point.
My final point, and then we should turn to Russia, the rogue nation to the east of Ukraine, is that I think the assassination, the RAW's action, also pretty clearly indicates that, not that we needed, I think, further evidence, that India does only partially embrace, it would appear, the obligations of being a full part of the normative Western system. It is a part, not a part of, but apart from that system. It is a third pole, and pretty clearly that seems to be affirmed to me by this operation. But I think enough on India, fascinating and timeless as it be, and you should educate us on the disaster in all of its ways, implications of what's happening in Russia.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.